Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. The book by Peter Schmitz is now available. Order it at your local bookstore or through Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. Hello and welcome to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. Today we share with you the next installment of the story we began in our last episode, the history of the Philadelphia Drama Guild. Join us as we continue our Season 4, The Rise of Modern Philadelphia Theater. Gregory Poggi grew up in New York City in the 1950s and 60s, where he fell in love with theater. After attending Iona College, he went on to Indiana University in Bloomington, where he got both his M.A. and his Ph.D. His decades of subsequent leadership in American theater is astoundingly long and distinguished. Greg is a founder of the Indiana Repertory Theater in Indianapolis. He has served as the managing director of the Royal Manitoba Theater Center in Winnipeg, and he has led university theater and artistic management programs in Dallas, Texas, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. He is, in fact, the perfect person for us to interview at this point in the overall storyline of our podcast, because during the 1980s, he was the head of the Philadelphia Drama Guild. Greg Poggi has not lived in the Philadelphia area for 35 years now, however, and he left long before I arrived on the scene. We, in fact, have never met before. But when I reached out to him via email, he immediately and graciously agreed to be interviewed. We spoke by telephone early in November of 2024, which accounts for the particular sound quality of the recording. But really, I think the interview turned out quite well. I learned a lot of great detail and stories from him that I could have gotten nowhere else. Although, of course, I have edited the sound file for both time and clarity. Greg started our conversation with a question for me.
Who are you?
Which, was not at all an unreasonable thing to ask, really. So I spent about 10 minutes talking about myself, about the podcast, and of course about the book, which was about to be released right then and was very much on my mind. So I'm skipping past all those preliminary minutes and moving ahead to the moment when I began to ask him about his own time spent working in Philadelphia theater.
Happy to accommodate you. Just shoot away.
Well, I note that you sort of walk into the scene, as it were, in about the year 1979. When the Drama Guild was already had been established as an institution for about 20 years,
Correct.
But it had been a professional company since about 1970, when it became the resident company, so to speak, at the Walnut Street, which was a venue and not a producing organization then.
Correct.
And it had been through various leaderships, including Douglas Seal. And
I walked into the theater when Douglas Seal was still artistic director.
Right. Now, you came from Canada.
I was at what is now the Royal Manitoba Theater Center from 74 to 79.
Right.
In Winnipeg.
Well, that's interesting because I realized that both Bob Headley and Bernard Havard are also from that part of the world.
Yes. And before that, I am a co-founder of the Indiana Repertory Theater in Indianapolis.
Wow.
Which is in its, I think it's 55th season at this point.
Right. So
I went to graduate school at Indiana University in Bloomington, where I got my master's degree and then my PhD. And at that time, 50 miles up the road in Indianapolis, they didn't have a equity professional theater company. So I thought, well, this would be fun to do for a little while. And there we are. Indiana Repertory Theater still going strong. I got a job at Manitoba, interestingly enough, beating out Bernard Havard for that job.
Wow.
As managing director. And then I didn't go there to change my nationality. I went there for the work. And I became very anxious to get back to the U.S., being from the U.S. And so the position came up in Philadelphia, and I applied for it, and I got it. And of course, at the time, Douglas Seal was the then artistic director starting the season. So I came in August, and he was already there and announced his season. So I inherited that season. I also inherited a theater which on the books had a accumulated deficit of almost $300,000.
Wow.
And I thought, that's manageable if we work at cleaning things up.
And that was not unheard of for other nonprofit theater companies. I mean, certainly other companies had been known to carry debts forward sort of manage them through corporate help and grants and so forth.
The irony of the situation at the time was deficit was actually much larger.
Oh.
Even though the audited statement listed it at $281,000, it was much, much larger. And my first few months was dealing with the board of directors of the Drama Guild, whose chairman put his head in the sand on the issue. And so I had to go around the board and interview them and find anybody who had the brains and the brawn and the ability to tackle this deficit. The person I found who was going to do that happened to be the president at the time of what was known as the Philadelphia National Bank, PNB. His name was Frederick Heldring. And I walked into his office and I said, if we don't clean this mess up, we'll be bankrupt in 2 weeks.
Wow.
That got his attention.
But why would that, and why didn't he just say, oh, well, bye? Why
he was the president of one of the two major banks in the city, and the Drama Guild owed that bank an $80,000 loan.
I see.
So not only would he be sitting on the board of a bankrupt organization, but he would be dealing with the fact that his bank was not going to get that $80,000.
Ah, so you were able to leverage the fact that in some way
Correct.
The debtor has a little power over the person who they owe money
He went into his act,
yeah.
and he commandeered some members of the board, including the late Goldman Sachs partner in Philadelphia, George Ross.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically, he and Ross just tackled the thing head on. And as the months progressed, we whittled away at it until by April of 1980, the deficit was down to less than $10,000.
So what was the main tactic that you guys were able to do? Was
aggressive fundraising, and
see.
The fact that the board at the time was outdoing itself to show that they were heroic members of the board. We had one board meeting where one director got up, and we were looking to get more cash flow going. And he got up and he shamed the rest of the board by saying, all right, I'm good for $10,000. Nobody expected this from this man. And the rest of the board kind of paid attention, and they all started flipping more money into the till. Because they didn't want to be upped by this board member who they didn't think had that kind of resource.
I see.
Remember, this is 1980. So
before the Reagan tax
quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
At the same time, we were looking for a new artistic director. Douglas Seal's contract was not renewed. He thought he was going to go to Broadway by taking a show by an English playwright called Thark, P-H-A-R-K,
Yes, I just saw that in the newspaper archive.
Yeah, and it was kind of an eccentric English comedy with not much of an American following, but he thought this was going to be his ticket to Broadway, and it wasn't, of course. Anyway, his contract was not renewed. We were also looking for a new artistic director, and at the time we found a woman by the name of Irene Lewis.
Yes.
Who was at the Hartford Stage Company as the associate artistic director, Hartford, Connecticut. And Irene decided to take the job. It was offered to her. She took the job, and we started the new season in the fall of 1980. She did a brilliant production of Watch on the Rhine, a wonderful play that she had directed once before, and it was terrific. It turned out rather well. We had a theater critic at the time. We had two major newspapers. One was the Inquirer, the other was the Bulletin, an afternoon paper. The theater critics had a rivalry, and so Bill Collins wrote for the Inquirer, and Ernie Shear wrote for the Bulletin, and they were always trying to outdo each other. Anyway, the season continued. We did a 5-play season, 5 productions. We had to leave the Walnut Street Theater. In addition to everything else, they kicked us out because then one of the major board members of the Walnut Street Theater felt he wanted to be an artistic director and producer. So he kicked us out. They kicked us out.
Right.
We weren't the best of tenants to begin with. Let me tell you that.
Well, I can see in the records there were some complaints on their side that they.
Yes. and the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania gave us a home and gave us 2 weeks. They picked the dates every 2 weeks. Not every, but 5 times a year they gave us 2 weeks. This was at 36th and Walnut. And the Walnut Street Theater was at 9th and Walnut, and people didn't want to go to that neighborhood at the Annenberg Center. It was in West Philadelphia.
Yes, it was a different part of town, and it was a different kind of theater. It was a modern theater instead of the old-fashioned proscenium arch like the Walnut.
Right, and Irene adapted to that space, and then from her first production, things started to go a little bit south. She became very unhappy until she finally directed the 4th production of the season, was The Front Page.
Right, classic Ben Hecht comedy.
Big cast show, mostly men, of course, and the then theater critic William B. Collins of the Inquirer basically gave it a totally negative review and just harped on it in his Monday column as well. And he harped on her. I don't know what his problem was, maybe because she was a woman, perhaps. In any case, he was just after her. And she became very upset about all of that. Her work was not being appreciated. The 5th show of the season was a 2-hander, which it was a very lovely production. She didn't direct it, and it didn't do very well. So in addition to raising money to retire the deficit, we had to contend with selling season tickets for the next season at the same time that Irene was having qualms about whether she should stay or not. Mm-hmm. And she finally decided to resign in the summer of 1980? Yeah.
Yeah. And eventually she ends up in Baltimore, right? She ends up at...
Eventually she went there. She was friends with the then artistic director, but she left Philadelphia, didn't want anything to do with the place. She was very unhappy, and I was stuck with another situation to deal with there.
Right.
No artistic director. And so I picked the season, started off, and the season ended up doing very well, including one of the shows was a new play, English play by Dennis Keenan called Dear Daddy, which got great reviews. It was the second show of that particular season. and included a rave review in Time magazine.
Wow.
It was directed by a man named William Woodman. He was the former artistic director of the Goodman Theater in Chicago, and we got along famously. And so I used him quite free. I was still managing director. We had no artistic director. I did that for several years as managing director. The board didn't think they needed to hire anybody else, and they didn't want to give me the title which I asked them to give me, which was producing managing director.
Right.
Or producing artistic director, as opposed to just managing director, because I was selecting the plays and the directors and so forth. We did that for several years, and the theater survived quite happily.
Yes, I noticed that, interestingly, throughout your tenure, the Drama Guild seems to have been in the black, which was...
Yes.
What was your secret sauce? What do you attribute that fiscal
raising
to?
Money,
yeah,
going around the community, putting together a sensible budget so that you would have the dollars from the ticket sales were about, I can't remember the exact number, but we would raise 35% of the budget from contributions and grants. And one of the saviors of the Drama Guild was the Glen Mead Trust Company. They had a foundation, and they gave us some challenge grants. So for every dollar we raised, they would give us $2. And we were aggressive fundraisers to get that challenge grant.
Well, it's amazing how much you were able to get the business community and the charitable community to rally around this institution. What would you say was the feeling amongst the sort of executive class, the sort of people that would be on boards, about Philadelphia theater? The tryout town era was ending. Was there a feeling that Philadelphia wouldn't matter as a city, as a locale, if it didn't have a major theater institution like other major cities? Or was it competition amongst each other, like we want to beat the people that are on the orchestra board or the museum board?
Yes, it was a feeling that the commercial tryout situation had changed significantly in Philadelphia. It wasn't like it used to be, and there was a need for regular theater going in the city and suburbs, and we filled that need. And we strengthened the board of directors and put things back together again, and then did sensible, good seasons with inspiring shows. Not every one show was a huge success, but we put together a substantial season that the public appreciated.
Yes, I'm looking here at an article dated July 14th, 1981, and it mentions that you'd scheduled Dear Daddy by Dennis Kanan, and then you would do Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, then be Albert Inarato's Gemini, and then the Goldoni farce, Servant of Two Masters, and ending with a revival of Paul Osborne's Oliver. Now, so some of those are war horses, and some of those are sort of, Gemini would be a Philly favorite. It's set in Philadelphia. It had,
Albert Inarato came to town. He was from Philadelphia.
Right.
That work had never been produced in his native city.
Right. It had run for like 5 years on Broadway, but hadn't been done in
off
Philly.
Broadway. Yes.
Yeah.
And Oliver was directed by the man who did Mornings at 7 on Broadway.
Vivian Madelon.
Vivian Madelon. He directed, but he had a big success for Mornings at 7, and we had a wonderful cast, including Nancy Marchand in that production, which people had hoped might transfer to New York. It didn't, but it was a wonderful production.
Right. Well, that was often the hope in those days, that a nonprofit theater would happen upon some production that would have legs that could then transfer and add an additional revenue stream back to the original theater, getting commercial money. Did that ever happen the whole time you were on your tenure there?
Not really. No, it didn't happen in Philadelphia anyway. For the Drama Guild, no, not at all.
I was myself was being interviewed by a graduate student, I think at Drexel, who was writing about shows that transferred to commercial venues from nonprofit theaters. And I said, I couldn't really think of anything from Philadelphia that went on to New York. It doesn't seem to, I mean, there were certainly attempts to, and
Right.
I think the Walnut has tried to several times, but it's never really happened.
The Walnut, when it basically, we lost our lease at the Walnut, and they started to produce on their own.
Right, by 1983, Werner then was hired to become a producing artistic director at the Walnut. So you now had competition, as it were, in your old space. And at the same time, the Philadelphia company had gone equity and was now producing plays at the Plays and Players Theater. And the Wilma Theater, a former sort of theater collective, the Zizkas had taken that over and were now had built their own place over on Sansom Street. So there begins to be a number of other nonprofit companies regularly producing a mixture of new and classic plays for the Philadelphia audience. Was it your experience that this competition were companies cannibalizing each other's audiences, or was it growing the audience to have all these organizations?
I'd say growing. No, the Wilma Theater started out very, very small in a tiny space on Sansom Street. And the Philadelphia company started out small as well. And actually, they all kind of reinforced each other, and an appreciation of indigenous American theater being produced in Philadelphia. It wasn't a theater that was simply assuming shows from elsewhere that will move on to Broadway or something of that sort. Yeah.
I note that you tried, during your tenure, to start something called POP, or POP, Plays of Philadelphia, where you were trying to Playwrights of Philadelphia, where you were trying to support local playwriting talent.
Correct. Playwrights of Philadelphia was an attempt to to find and nurture native talent in playwrights. That lasted a couple of years. It was not, it was in many ways an experimental program, and it was intended to encourage indigenous writers, and it was not terribly well received by the media. They would look at it and think, well, this work has to be as finished as it could be. No, it's a play in progress. We're working here, and it lasted a few years.
Do you think that was the old tryout town mindset, that they were used to seeing shows that were on their way to New York and Philly will make or break these? And I've seen that mentioned several places, that the transition from the tryout town mindset to supporting an indigenous company, was certainly a problem for the Theater of the Living Arts. One of the reasons why it didn't end up catching fire, and certainly one that, like, the Philadelphia company struggled with, because I noticed during the 1980s they nearly crashed and burned. I know Sarah Garandic had to stop producing for a while.
Exactly.
And it looked like, from what else I can understand, the POP was struggling. Although you had good relationships with funders, it was hard to get a consistent funder for that program, because by the mid and late 1980s, because of government cuts to the arts, we're now in the midst of the Reagan administration, they were cutting for social services, they were decreasing, regular raises in the National Endowment for the Arts, and that a lot of charitable foundations were now feeling like they needed to go fill those gaps. And supporting a playwright wasn't at the top of their ideological to-do list.
That's correct.
But still, you continued for an 11-year tenure. And,
that's correct.
And you were always a managing director. Did they ever give you the producing managing director title, I hope?
Yeah, they finally gave it to me. But by the end of the 1980s, I was getting pretty tired trying to find material that would work on the Annenberg stage. It was a big theater.
Yeah, Mary said to me it was very wide, and that it was hard to make. It didn't compress well. The edge of the energy went out the edges, she said. Yes.
And I was getting very tired of all of that. And I thought, all right, I put in my 9th year. All right, I'll give it another year. By the 11th year, I said, I've got to, I should move on somehow.
And the theater was the Annenberg, but your offices were elsewhere, right? They were on Arch Street.
15th Street opposite one of the big social clubs in the city. I used to wave to the people as they were having lunch. And then we still had many of the same board members who had been with the theater when it was in the early troubles it had back in the 79, 80, 81 period.
Right.
And then the then chairman of the board, who had been chairman for many years, George Ross, he's now deceased. He basically didn't want to renew my contract. You know, he thought we could do better. We can do better. So they didn't renew my contract, for which I was eternally grateful under my breath.
Well, you had already sort of had developed relationships at Southern Methodist University in Texas, is that right?
Yes, in Dallas. And I decided that I would move to Dallas and take that position permanently. It was a graduate program in which I would be the director of a program where the students got 2 degrees, an MBA from the business school at SMU and an MA in arts administration from the art school. The 2-year program. When they were finished, I would put them in a permanent internship for the whole summer that often would lead to them getting a job with that arts organization somewhere around the country. And I was very happy doing that work. At the same time I was doing that work, they tapped me to become the consulting artistic director of the Dallas Theater Center, because their artistic director, a young man, a very talented guy who was just appointed, died in a freak accident on the first play of the season that he was artistic director. He was 35 years old, and he was in an ambulance because he was in a minor crash, automobile crash on his way to work, and the medics gave him the wrong medication, and he died as a result of that. And so they turned to me to be a consultant, which I did while they looked for a permanent artistic director. I didn't want the job. I was managing my program, and I did 2 jobs for 14 months while they looked for a permanent artistic director.
Right.
Enough already.
Yeah. Well, I see that you so it was established by 1989 that you were going to be moving on, and they were looking for the new artistic director.
Correct.
And eventually, they found Mary Robinson, and
Correct.
We've covered that in an earlier interview with her and all her years there. But one thing that I noticed was that as you were leaving town, as it were, there was an article in the paper from your former nemesis, William B. Collins, saying, "Hey, Mr. Poggi's done a wonderful job, and I've been very rough on him over the years, but he's never been less than wonderful to me. And I, as a theater critic, I want to say that now." So, I hope that at least felt a little satisfying.
It did.
Yeah.
Well, you know, what I would do is I would take him out to lunch once or twice a year to his favorite restaurant, and we would just talk about theater. He wasn't critical to me personally. And while we were having lunch, we would talk about nonprofit theater, commercial theater. Of course, he would review, as you well know, both of them. And we would just have a civilized conversation. And nothing, even though he would pan a show, I didn't bring it up. I just let it go.
Okay.
You know.
Well, and by that time, the Bulletin had gone out of business, so the Inquirer was the big dog in town. So it was important there were alternative papers, but I don't think they really mattered for your audience. Right? Yeah,
that's right. It became the paper in the city.
I keep trying to convince I teach now at Temple University, and I keep trying to tell the students how powerful theater critics used to be, and they don't believe me.
In the old days, they could make or break a show before it could get to New York, to get to Broadway.
Right.
That's what happened.
That was the reason to be a Philly theater critic.
Yes.
During the tryout town era. Yeah.
That was amazing. Yes.
Now, by the late 1980s, when the tryout market is gone, and it's mostly these smaller nonprofit theater companies, did you, as a person who was administering and running this company, feel that the critical standards were not adjusting to the reality of the new situation? That we're trying to serve our local community, and you're holding us to some standard as if we're all doing Broadway tryouts all the time.
Well, I think that was part of it. Yeah, the sensibility on the part of those critics was very much influenced, because it was Philadelphia, so close to New York City, was very much influenced by that commercial theater scene.
Yeah, and they would commonly go, I see that, and at the time, they would commonly be sent to New York, and they would review Broadway plays and off-Broadway plays as well. So that was all part of their milieu.
Correct.
So the actors you were bringing in and the directors you were bringing in, you never had a resident company the whole time you were there.
No, it didn't make sense economically, because the schedule that we had, that the Annenberg Center gave us, was too erratic. I managed to get the situation where we would go to a 3-week run for each production. But it had to be at dates that the Annenberg Center said you have to take those dates, whether you like it or not. So I didn't have the benefit of continuity during the course of the season. I had to just do 5 productions given these 5 dates. We would cast it in New York. We would always go there. We would sometimes use local actors.
You did hold local auditions for local equity artists.
Yes, we did. And we used some of them.
Right.
No doubt about that. But we used a lot of guest directors who were very much partial to auditioning in New York City.
But there must have been some, it certainly occurred to you, and certainly among the board, that if this was the standing problem, that you didn't control the venue, and you had to first deal with the Walnuts issues and then with the Annenberg issues, was there a push at some point saying, we need to get our own stage? We need to have our own place?
Please, don't get me into that.
Well, I'm here to get you into that, because
I tried 3 times over the course of my tenure in Philadelphia at the Drama Guild, 3 times, to push the board to go out and develop a fundraising initiative for our own home, our own theater facility. And 3 times I was defeated by the board, who felt, oh, well, look, we're doing okay at the Annenberg Center. Why should we go out and raise millions of dollars? We don't need to do that. Finally, the then board chairman got, fed up with me pushing and pushing. So that's why one of the reasons, they wanted new leadership. They didn't want anybody pushing them to get a new facility. Now, Mary Robinson had troubles, as you probably know, dealing with that facility at the Annenberg Center, and she wanted to do work in other size venues locally in Philadelphia.
Right.
She just didn't want to use that Annenberg Center all the time.
Yes,
remember
the
Annenberg Center
she used the MTI space, a new space in a converted church nearby. But that the audience then sort of rebelled and said, no, we want to go to our same seats. There was a very conservative sort of feeling amongst Philadelphia audiences, like, this is just a social thing that we do, and we want it to be the same every year, and don't push us into new spaces and don't make us find new parking places. Right.
That was it. The audience was very conservative about their feelings about the space. And the Annenberg space was just, finding the right material for it. Anyway, under my watch, 5 times a year to make it work in that space was very, very difficult.
So you moved on, and Mary took over, and then you've subsequently been both at SMU and then at University of Michigan. I mean, and I would love to cover that, but it's not really the province of our podcast. But you must have looked back after you left Philadelphia and saw, the events that transpired in the next few years with the Drama Guild suddenly cratering, the audience cratering under Mary for various reasons, which we covered with her. And And then the Walnut Street, where you had originally been, suddenly sort of eating the Drama Guild lunch, as it were, sort of taking that subscription audience, and they went full bore into that build your subscription audience mode, subscribe now. And they developed this huge subscription base.
Yes, they did.
And
yes.
So looking back, as you then look back at it from afar, what thoughts did you have watching these events transpire back in Philly?
Well, you must remember the Walnut Street Theater was in a wonderful location there in the city itself, surrounded by all these great restaurants and nightlife and such. So they had a built-in opportunity to build an audience there with the right management, which they ended up having. You could argue that their programming was very lightweight. You could argue that their programming was not terribly adventuresome.
Well, Vox Populi, Bernard would say, no doubt, he's the voice of the people.
Yes.
He's said that to me several times, and that he said, I've got 1,200 seats to fill, and I need to find that number of people to get in here 8 times a week, or at least something approaching that.
Correct. And remember, when I first took over at the Drama Guild and we moved to the Annenberg Center, in the first year we were getting a substantial amount of money from the National Endowment for the Arts.
Right.
And that money kept decreasing as the years progressed till it was practically down to less than $10,000 a year.
Wow.
I mean, the Walnut Street Theater was funded by the William Penn Foundation in Philadelphia.
Right, they had a strong relationship with the Haas family and
Correct.
The foundation. Yeah.
And the foundation would not let that theater down at all. So it subsidized it enormously because it was to its advantage to keep that facility in tip-top shape,
right.
Which they did.
So and the Drama Guild, although it had acquired a lot of sort of popular cachet during the 70s and 80s, began to lose that to the
Walnut.
It. Yeah.
We lost it to the Walnut. Yes.
Right.
That's correct.
But then these other theater companies, the Wilma and the Philadelphia Theater Company, and eventually the Arden, which sort of started upstairs at the Walnut in a tiny space. Do you feel that previously said that it wasn't just a cannibalizing one audience to save the other, that the audience was growing? Was there a sense that the support for nonprofit theater and theater that was taking place in the city and was growing throughout the 80s? Was that an exciting feeling, or was it just,
It was growing. There was no doubt about that.
Okay.
When I left the when I left the Annenberg Center,
right.
We left it with 18,000 season ticket holders and a $100,000 fund surplus.
Man.
And you know the rest of what happened after that.
Well, you've had a continuing presence in American nonprofit theater. Did you ever come back to work in the Philadelphia area again in any capacity? I
don't know. I went to the University of Michigan because I was offered a position there as chair of the theater department, and I knew some of the people there from having worked with them in the field as actors and directors. And so it was very appealing to go there because it is a wonderful university, as you well know.
Of course, yeah.
And the theater program was very vital. And so I went there, and I spent 15 years there. Or was it 16? I can't remember which. Then I decided, well, maybe it's time to go to a place where there isn't so much snow. One winter, it was 93 inches of snow that winter.
Right. I think a lot of Michiganders come to that decision,
I don't know if I can handle more of that. And so we decided that my wife is originally from Dallas, Texas. She grew up here. So we decided that we would come back here. And interestingly enough, when I came back here, SMU offered me a position again for another year. was
Right.
during COVID, so
Right.
we had to do that kind of long distance, as it were, from home.
Well, Greg, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad that we've got in touch with each other, and you've been so generous with your memories and with your time. I don't want to take up too much more of it. Was there anything that you think we didn't cover about your years at the Drama Guild?
I don't know, but if there's anything you think that needs further discussion, don't hesitate to give me a call.
Okay, thank you. That's very generous.
I'd be very happy to speak with you again if there's any gaps or other explanations you may need.
All right.
I'd be happy to visit with you again. And your book is out when? What's it called?
November 30th. It's called Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia.
Okay, by you.
Yeah, by me, Peter Schmidt.
So
it's on Amazon if you look for it.
Okay, I will check it out.
Well, let's all of us thank Gregory Poggi once again for sharing his memories and insights with us, and I certainly appreciate that he managed to bring up my book at the end there, which gives me the occasion to remind you all once again that it is now available for ordering. Go right to your own local independent bookstore and ask for it. But you can also find it through all the well-known online booksellers, as well as on the website of the publisher, Brookline Books, in Havertown, Pennsylvania. Of course, you could do what my cousin mistakenly did and contact the lovely small independent bookstore in Brookline, Massachusetts, and get them to mail my book to you. It was kind of a long way for it to be sent, but because she lives on the other side of the country in Portland, Oregon. But it was all fine. The book went through the mail, got to her in the end, and she tells me she's enjoying it all the more now because it has a great little story to go along with it. That's what I really love about owning actual physical books. The object itself becomes part of your life story and carries its own history and associations. Of course, if you'd like to order the book as an ebook for your Kindle device, that's great too. We welcome you all. And if you're in the Philly area, keep an eye out on social media for announcements about author events, and book signings, or interviews I might be doing over the next few months. The podcast is now on Blue Sky and Mastodon and YouTube, as well as, for the moment anyway, Facebook and Instagram and Threads. We'll be back with another podcast episode in a couple weeks. I think next we will re-release the interview I did with Mary Robinson that we've mentioned many times here with Greg back in May of 2022 in order to complete the story of the Philadelphia Drama Guild. Thank you for listening today and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.